Hello, and welcome to today's version of Smart Aleck's Guide, pages 147 to 153, which is scanned into Google Classroom. You can read it on your own, or you can watch this painful video. Okay, before we actually start reading today, normally we would have taken 2 or 3 whole class periods in which I needed to teach you about monopolies. I wish my paper wouldn't curl quite so much. Okay, so I'm going to hold this up for a couple minutes and then kind of explain it. Okay, in a horizontal monopoly, which is flat out illegal, but companies do it all the time because it's totally profitable and it's worth taking a risk on until the government busts you, because by the time the government busts you and takes it through the court system and you appeal 50 times, you could be making money hand over fist in the meantime. A horizontal monopoly is very straightforward. You have several businesses. The example that we would have used during class was you were a maker of socks. Owner A makes socks, owner B makes socks, owner C, D, E, F makes socks, okay? Maybe owner A specializes in just like, owner A makes just regular run-of-the-mill white cotton socks. Owner B, though, makes sports socks, owner C makes fancy, like decorative socks, owner D makes performance socks, whatever. You can make them different if you want. The point of a horizontal monopoly is that eventually one of the owners buys out all of the other people's businesses. And they can do this perfectly legally. I mean, there's nothing against the law about buying out somebody else's business. Where this becomes a monopoly is when you are left with one person who owns all of the sock businesses and therefore can set the price and can set the quality. So, for example, they could be making socks that fall apart after 2 months and charging you more for them because you don't have any other choices. You can't just go to somewhere else on the rack and pick out a different pair of socks. And in fact, what a lot of people do when they start forming a monopoly like this is that they actually buy the rights to the name of the previous sock company. So it looks like you have a ton of choices. In reality, they're all being made in the same factory somewhere, possibly in China. And the owner can set price and quality and you can't do anything about it. It's illegal, but totally worth it to try. Okay, and the other type of monopoly, this is going to be more difficult. It's called a vertical monopoly, and we draw it like a vertical line. This one is a lot more subtle. You may not even be trying to create an illegal monopoly in this case. What you do instead, we'll stick with socks as our example, is that instead of buying out other people's sock businesses and putting them out of business, what you're doing is you're buying all the means of production, manufacturing, distribution for your socks. So think through the process of if you were going to start making socks, what would you need to have? Well, you'd need to have cotton, you'd need to have elastic, you'd need to have dyes to dye the socks, you'd need to have those annoying little plastic hanger things that people hang the socks in the stores on, you'd have to have plastic packaging for the socks. There are all kinds of pieces of production that you would need to have. In addition to that, you'd have to own a building, and you'd ideally have workers, and you'd have sewing machines, and you'd have people who dyed the socks, and you'd have people who distributed the socks in trucks, most likely. And the trucks would need fuel, so then you'd buy an oil company to fuel your, here comes the cat. Hi. To fuel your particular line of socks. Okay, the point is that if the price of fuel, for example, if the price of gasoline suddenly goes up, other sock companies are going to be affected by that. They're going to have to reflect that in their prices a little bit. If you own your own oil company, though, you can hold out for a lot longer before you have to respond to those jumps in prices by raising the prices of your sock. If, for instance, there's some huge blight on a cotton plantation and all the other companies go out of business because they can't get a hold of cotton or they have to pay a lot more because of their cotton, you don't, because you're controlling your own supply of the cotton industry. It doesn't always work out perfectly, but it puts you in a lot better position to be able to control the price and the quality of your product. And eventually, the reason why a vertical monopoly is illegal is because it will eventually become a horizontal monopoly. If you can control your prices and your competitor can't, eventually you're going to drive them out of business, whether that's what you meant to do or not. Okay, so normally we would have spent a couple days on that. There's your 5 minutes on it, and now we'll get into the reading. Okay, so we're starting on page 147, Rich Industrial Jerks. The huge growth industry, including factories, steel mills, and railroads, made a handful of people filthy, stinking rich. And remember, the early 1900s, late 1800s, into the early 1900s are called the Gilded Age. That it looked like everything was fabulous, but if you scratched the surface just a little bit, most people were living in poverty and their lives were pretty miserable. Made a handful of people filthy, stinking rich. There's a reason they call it filthy, stinking rich, and not shining, happy, rich. There were accounts of these guys hanging around smoking cigarettes rolled in $100 bills and buying their dogs necklaces that cost $15,000, about the amount their employees would earn in 40 years of hard work. But they weren't just decadent. Side note here, we'd stop and define decadent. Decadent means obscenely luxurious. I guess the most common way to usually hear this used is with chocolate cake. Like there's chocolate cake, and then there's chocolatey chocolate cake, and then there's decadent chocolate cake, where it's almost too much, if that's possible, for chocolate cake. Anyway, but they weren't just decadent, they were also remarkably corrupt, so much so that they came to be known as robber barons. J.P. Morgan, a banker, started making money through various schemes to profit from the Civil War, in which he didn't serve. He was one of those guys who paid to get out of it. There was barely a big financial deal in the country that he wasn't involved in, and at the height of his wealth, he and his companies were, by one estimate, worth more than everything in the country west of the Mississippi River. He owned almost half of all the railroads in the country, and the rest were owned by his friends. Meanwhile, John D. Rockefeller amassed one of history's largest fortunes by forming the Standard Oil Company, which soon became so powerful that it could, and did, buy off large chunks of the government. Monopolies, companies that controlled an entire industry, were illegal, but one of Rockefeller's attorneys came up with an idea of making the company into a holding company, a collection of smaller companies that could get away with more than a big one. Rockefeller thus became the richest man in the world. Some say the richest of all time. If you measure how much he had as a percentage of the total economy, today, nobody, not even Bill Gates, comes close to being as rich as Rockefeller was. These new trusts were able to take over entire industries, and soon about 5,000 major companies had been organized into about 300 trusts that pretty much ran the country. Without any competition, these trusts kept prices high and wages low. And every time they use the word trust, they're talking about a monopoly. And the presidents at the time couldn't do much about that. After all, the government was very much under the control of the jerks who ran the trusts. It didn't stop there. Newspaper barons such as William Randolph Hearst hit on the notion that if nothing exciting was going on, they could just make something up. They used sensational stories in their newspapers to push the country into the Spanish-American War strictly because they knew that wars sold newspapers. Oh, for heaven's sake. Please hold for a second. This is my cat. Labor. Rich and jerky though these guys were, they were also noted philanthropists. A philanthropist is somebody who philanthropist is someone who gives their time and money to charity. Which makes them look like a great person. I mean, that should be a compliment if somebody gets called a philanthropist, unless they're doing it to cover up all the bad stuff that they're also doing otherwise. Rich and jerky though these guys were, they were also noted philanthropists, giving huge amounts to charity and establishing museums that we still visit today, many of which have above-average gift shops. At the same time, many of them treated their employees like dirt. People in those days sometimes worked 16-hour days in factories that were dark and dangerous, and when the unsanitary conditions made you sick, you couldn't take a sick day or expect any health benefits. You either showed up to work or got fired. Life expectancy for factory workers tended to be low, and the pay was lousy. Many companies only paid in the form of credit to the company store, which often had higher prices than anyone could really afford. After 16 hours of work, workers still wouldn't have made enough to cover the day's expenses and ended up even further in debt. And there are countless stories of workers getting together and asking for a raise, only to be fired on the spot just for asking. Even worse, there were no real child labor laws in those days, and many of the nastier jobs were held by kids. At one point, something like 20% of all kids in the country were working in a place like a factory or a mine. It paid better than going to school, but it was far less pleasant. Every now and then, workers would try to get organized and form a union, threatening to quit if conditions weren't improved. Often, entire workforces were fired just for bringing up the idea. Other times, strike breakers, guys with clubs and rifles, were sent in to attack the strikers and force them back to work. Irish coal miners formed a group called the Molly Maguires, and after being accused of violence, 19 or 20 of the leaders were executed. A couple of years later, when railroad workers went on strike after having their already tiny salaries cut, more than 100 workers were killed and thousands were put in jail. As strikes got bigger, robber barons used their influence to get the government to send the army to break up the strikers. One of the most common arguments against labor organizations was the claim that they were run by socialists or anarchists. Often this was true. Many of the groups had plans just beyond improving working conditions. They wanted to reorganize society itself. Their followers are still hanging around the outside of rock concerts, passing out pamphlets and looking generally unclean. These wide-eyed plans ended up doing most of the organizations more harm than good. And the ones that went off the deep end with plans for a new society or workers' paradise didn't get much done at all. Less radical groups got more accomplished. The American Federation of Labor, for example, focused on more practical matters like better pay, better safety, an 8-hour workday, and a 5-day work week. These guys were much more successful at getting fair labor laws passed, but the robber barons and the trusts were still in charge of the country, and everyone knew it. The Spanish-American War. This connects directly to the jungle that we're going to be reading next, because if you only remember one thing about the Spanish-American War, it's the fact that during the Spanish-American War, more American soldiers died of bad meat, which was given to them by the United States government, than died of bullets. More on that later. The Spanish-American War of 1898 didn't happen just because the newspapers made up stories to provoke such public outrage that citizens would demand that the country go to war. That might have been one of the major reasons we ended up getting involved, but there were legitimate reasons as well. At the time, Cuba was still controlled by Spain, and Spain was rejecting the Cubans' request to become independent. As tensions between loyalists, who wanted to stay Spanish, and rebels got violent, a battleship called the USS Maine was sent to Cuba, only 90-odd miles from Florida, to protect American interests there. The Maine sank in Havana Harbor the next month. What caused it to sink has never really been determined. The Americans said it was a gunpowder explosion, and the Spanish believe there's been some sort of internal explosion. But newspaper editors, most notably William Randolph Hearst, had no qualms about telling people that the Spanish officials had sunk the ship, and American voters began to cry a slogan written for them by the newspapers. "Remember the Maine and to hell with Spain!" Gradually, as the situation between the Loyalists and the Cuban rebels became more and more of a civil war, the American government, then led by William McKinley, decided to support the rebels. In April of 1898, the United States declared war on Spain with the intention of driving them out of Cuba. Theodore Roosevelt, a historian like us, who had worked as a cowboy, had been appointed to the United States Civil Service Commission, taken control of and cleaned up the New York Police Department, become a political rock star and ended up Assistant Secretary of the Navy, resigned his commission to fight in the war. He helped organize a group of cowboys into a volunteer band of soldiers known as the Rough Riders, which he was eventually put in charge of. In the most famous battle of the war, in fact, probably the only famous battle of the war, Roosevelt led the Rough Riders in a charge up San Juan Hill. The Spanish surrendered only 4 months after the war began, and Roosevelt became a national hero. He returned home and became governor of New York, but he never stopped referring to the Battle of San Juan Hill as his finest hour. For the rest of his life, he preferred to be called Colonel, even though, spoiler alert, Mr. President would have been more appropriate. The Spanish-American War may have been short and ultimately forgettable, but it did help heal the still festering wounds of the Civil War. For the first time since the 1860s, Northern and Southern soldiers, not to mention black and white soldiers, fought alongside one another toward a common goal. During Roosevelt's later political campaigns, groups of Confederate veterans were known to sing the Battle Hymn of the Republic, while bands of Union veterans played Dixie, in a remarkable show of mutual respect. And that's our segment for today. Please tune in tomorrow. Bye!